Good morning, Year 12. Thank you for watching this video for our lesson today. I thought I'd try something a little bit different. Certainly the school has said, please don't be on Zoom for the whole period. It is really exhausting. I do appreciate and understand that. I do find it really exhausting to be on Zoom all the time. So this past week, whilst you guys were working in your SAC, I did work with my other classes in producing these videos. Their videos are a lot shorter than this one. I know we've got a lot of content to go through, but I thought actually pre-recording our lessons might actually be a lot better for you guys. Feel free to pause and do whatever you need to do to get the information. You can rewind, you can fast forward the boring bits. I promise you there's no boring bits in this class. Perhaps these recorded lessons will be a lot easier for you to navigate. I will still be available online. Of course, when we have a scheduled class, I will make sure that I'm available, so you can jump onto gmail.com and you can use the chat function, or you can send me an email as well. I will be available. So I won't be coming to you live. It is pre-recorded. And so hopefully that just makes it a lot easier for you. And you know what? Look, you might be, you might not be able to actually work during the period that we have geography. So if you do want to look at these videos it might be later on in the day or maybe earlier in the day. It's completely up to you. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more freedom in terms of completing your classes. And also I find it actually allows me to put a lot more information in a much shorter time as well. So let me know what you think about this pre-recorded lesson. Give me some feedback if you do like it. If you rather do Zoom, I've been told I've got to keep my Zooms to maximum 20 minutes, which is really, really hard to do. So you'll notice that this video that I've got for you goes for about 50 minutes. So that's a lot better than me talking at you for 75. So I'll let us get straight into it, and I'll present you with our information on processes for deforestation. So I hope you'll enjoy it and get a lot of information out of this.
So our learning intention today, we want to be able to look at what are the natural processes of deforestation. We're then going to look at the human activities influencing deforestation. And we'll go a little bit further into that in terms of what is influencing those in terms of political, economic, and social factors. And then lastly, are these two processes interconnected? So can they influence each other rather? And if that is the case, how is that? So that's what we're hoping to look at today. And our success criteria. So you should be able to explain the natural processes involved in deforestation, explain the human activities that influence deforestation. I'd like you to analyze any interconnection between the two processes, and of course, describe and analyze data relating to deforestation and the processes. So that's just simply looking at any tables, graphs, maps, etc. That are either in the textbook that you found in your own research, and of course what I will show you on screen as well. Now to get us started, just a quick overview of what are the main causes of deforestation. And this is just actually straight from the textbook that I've pulled this information from. And it's looking at the tropical world specifically. So a lot of the examples that we look at will be from areas in our tropical rainforest, forests, etc. So the main causes of deforestation in South America, you'll see it timber logging. So people coming in, whether that's people, large corporations coming and logging timber. So that might be used for construction, selling on that timber for various other uses. You'll also see commercial agriculture I've got there, and they included cattle ranching, soy plantation, palm oil plantations, and sugar plantations. So a lot of these forests are being cut down to be used for commercial agriculture. So this is generally large-scale agriculture. If we go north from South America up into Central America, the main causes of deforestation there is actually just small farming for pastures and cropping. So it's not extensive. Well, it can be quite extensive, but it's not large scale operations. It tends to be much more smaller. Have a look at the geographic characteristics of Central America to South America, and you'll see that it is a much smaller land area as well. The next one, Southeast Asia. So head around to the other side of the world. The main causes of deforestation are timber logging again. So it could be logging of forests for building purposes, but also large-scale plantations in terms of palm oil plantations, coconut, teak, and rubber plantations are the most common causes of deforestation for Southeast Asia. So they're the countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Borneo. Borneo, it's not a country, but the island of Borneo, where you've got those large-scale plantations. So you can look at a lot of the maps that we have in the textbook, for example. When you look at Southeast Asia, I believe on page 111, you'll see Southeast Asia. And yeah, a lot of logging had actually occurred there to have plantations. So yes, you may be putting down new forest, but they're generally going to be forests that are of only one species, and so you lose out on that diversity as well. And lastly, in Africa, which is another problem area in terms of deforestation, what you'll find though is it's small scale activities that are causing deforestation. So subsidence, I always have trouble saying that word, agriculture. So that's small scale farming. One that is quite interesting there is that fuel wood collection. So in Africa being a really underdeveloped continent in terms of the status of countries there, forests are actually cut down to provide for fuel. So burning of timber in order for people to be able to cook or provide warmth for their homes and things like that. You and I would just turn the switch on to our air conditioning to keep warm, and we turn on the stove, which might be gas or electric, to be able to cook. In a lot of countries in Africa, that's not the case. It's actually timber that is used for heating and cooking. And then, of course, burning wood to produce charcoal. So, I'll put charcoal on the barbecue, but this, in many developing countries in Africa, charcoal is a really important source of fuel. You do have a large growing number of foreign timber companies coming into Africa and logging forests for timber, so it could be for building purposes as well. And commercial agriculture has also found its way into parts of Africa too. So I thought in order for us to properly understand the processes involved in deforestation, it would be a good idea to put together this little, flow chart outlining those main processes. So this is what I'm hoping, again, for you to be looking at for this lesson. So of course, we've got our deforestation. So are you able to actually define deforestation? That's going to be really important. How do you define it? Where is it located, etc.? If I run up to you in Coles, I'll ask you that question. Define deforestation. I'd expect you to be able to tell me where it's occurring and what it actually is. So go back to our previous lessons to catch up on that. So deforestation is made up of processes. So I've pointed out there's actually two different types of processes, and then you'll have multiple under those two different types of processes as well. So those processes being natural processes and then human processes, or human activities, you might also see it written as. So they're going to be our two main factors that are making up our processes. So with our natural processes, they're broken down into two categories: your biotic and abiotic factors or processes. So we'll go into detail with those a little bit later. And then our human processes, we're talking about building infrastructure, agriculture and food security, illegal logging, poor management, and war and civil disruption that are all these human activities that are forming processes that are causing deforestation. So they're the influencing factors. So let's have a look at that in a bit more detail. We'll start with the natural processes. So like I said, these are our biotic and abiotic factors. Your biotic, we're looking at insects, pests, and diseases, and your abiotic, fires, and climatic events or climate events. So you probably need to cast your mind back to year 7 science to understand the differences with it. So biotic and abiotic. I always try and remember it. Biotic, biology, so like living things, and abiotic, a being the negative, so non-living things. Although abiotic disturbances going to, like I said, are going to be like your climatic events or fires. Of course, can be influenced by humans, but put that aside for the moment and just consider them to be, say, like weather phenomenon and things like that. So let's have a look at them in a bit more detail. So with the biotic disturbances, these are going to be pests and disease outbreaks as an example. Now there's lots and lots of different biotic ones, but I'm going to point out the main ones. And of course, you can read a bit more detail of these in our textbook. If you are reading along at home, we're on page 115 for the natural processes. But I've outlined here that, pests and disease outbreaks, and it affects less than 2% of forests worldwide. That's in terms of pests and disease. So it doesn't seem like a significant amount of forests actually disturbed by these. And of course, that is quite natural. However, the consequences of that can actually be really, really devastating for a region. So it's unlikely that pests and disease outbreaks will affect every temperate forest around the world. It's going to affect a region. Say, for example, Canada and Western USA with this mountain pine beetle. That is a pest that has had significant damage caused to forest within that region. So we may have similar type forests here in Australia, but we don't have that biotic disturbance of the mountain pine beetle affecting the forests down here in Australia. We may have other pests. So the main point I guess I'm making is that you can have these pests and disease outbreaks and they're going to be affecting a region. Now, a lot of our forests as well have been fragmented as we cut down forests and urban life prevails. So a positive to this fragmentation could actually mean that that beetle wasn't able to actually reach more parts of the USA. It's not in the eastern part of the USA because of fragmentation. Although in that example, if you've ever looked at a map of the US, that fragmentation is actually quite natural by the fact that there's a desert in the middle of between the west and the east. But I hope you understand that point where that fragmentation could potentially be a positive in terms of stopping that biotic disturbance of that beetle, for example. Now, as I mentioned, the other natural process that causes deforestation are your abiotic factors. So these are your non-living things. So I've got them down as forest fires, climate events, and tectonic events. So I think the first two are quite self-explanatory, fires raging through a forest. Climate events, that could be drought, it could be flooding, it could be severe storms that can cause some deforestation. Tectonic events, for those that weren't in Unit 1 Geography or haven't been in Geography for a while, you may not remember that tectonic events are like landslides and earthquakes, so the movement of tectonic plates or the movement of land. So they can have an effect or a disturbance on those forested areas. So with wildfires, for example, it affects even less than what pests and disease affect worldwide. So only about 1% of forests worldwide are affected from them. It's worth noting that you may have forest biomes that naturally regenerate after wildfires. So much of Australia's temperate forest, for example, actually need that fire to regenerate. So it's actually quite a good event, and fires are obviously a naturally occurring phenomenon, but can be triggered by humans or caused by humans. But there are some forests that will actually benefit from fire. But not all. Some forests are going to be really sensitive to fire and could be really devastated by them. So, yeah, depending on the type of forest. What you'll also find is that the replacement of vast areas of tropical rainforest in really impoverished areas, so like the Amazon basin, for example, have been replaced with like weedy grasses, um, and so in parts of Indonesia as well, and Amazon basin, that you actually had widespread burning through those forests, and yeah, weedy vegetation has replaced those forests instead. The other thing I've got here is your El Nino events. If you remember the climatic phenomenon of El Nino and La Nina, these include our drought and flooding. So when you do have this El Nino, La Nina phenomenon occurring, you will have drought on one side of the world and flooding on the other. So oftentimes when Australia is going through drought, South America will be going through flooding, and that will actually flip. So we spoke about that last year, but those events where you'll have some severe storms, such as flooding, or you might have the influence of drought, which then can promote wildfires or bushfires, of course, is going to have an impact on the forests and how they are growing. So it could cause some forests to diminish or become degraded as well. Remember, degradation of forest falls under our deforestation here. The other one that I have listed there is that climate change. So climate change we've spoken about many times. It's, climate is shifting around the world. So where you may have a tropical rainforest now, may not be getting as much moisture. Rains may be falling further north or further south, and therefore that tropical rainforest is actually at risk of being degraded or becoming deforested because of the change in weather patterns that are occurring, increases and decreases in temperature. So species are going to be really sensitive to these kinds of weather patterns and climate-induced phenomenon. And so you could have these forests lose their health and probably die out due to heat stress and aridity as well. So they're the abiotic disturbances, so that are going to fall under our natural processes that are impacting deforestation and forest degradation. Okay, so next up we have our human processes. So we want to take a look at what human processes or what human activities are causing deforestation. So these ones are a much longer list. If you've been reading ahead in our chapter, you'll see that there's quite a bit of things that humans are doing. The textbook actually doesn't elaborate too much on them because they are just simple activities that we are doing that have caused this deforestation. So you could probably go into more detail as to what the textbook has shown. I would encourage you to look up some of the instances that they've pointed out, say like the building projects or the building infrastructure. There's some projects there that you could potentially have a look at. There's some figures in there that are really explanatory on terms of, developing countries, underdeveloped countries, and what's the trend in deforestation and the use of timber. So let's pull this apart a bit and see what human processes are causing deforestation. So there are lots of interconnected, direct and indirect causes of deforestation and forest degradation around the world. The importance of them varies across time and space as well. However, the greatest cause of deforestation around the world is actually your agricultural expansion. So, we looked at what are the natural processes. We saw that, pests, 2%, fires, 1%. But actually, the greatest threat is actually agriculture. 74% of forest deforestation and forest degradation is due to agricultural activity. So 3/4 of all cases are based on humans logging trees to make way for food. Okay, that's really important. We need to ensure our food security. So again, this is what I talk about as geographers. We have, as humans, we're going to need to cut down trees. We're going to need to cause some sort of pollution. But how are we going about doing it? So is this the best way of developing food? So I think what's really interesting for the future is how we can actually advance our farming practices so we're not actually cutting down vast amounts of forests. But at this present time, 74% of current deforestation is caused by agriculture. 19% is caused by logging. So this could be logging wood for building. So we might have a forest plantation where we're logging it to be able to supply timber for the homes that we're building, for example. So that sits at 19%. And lastly, we've got 6% as fuel wood collection. And sorry, I should say that these percentages are, made up for the human processes of deforestation. So keep those numbers separate for our natural processes. So fuel wood collection, I mentioned just at the very beginning. A lot of wood is actually used to heat people's homes. So you might have a fireplace at home. Then in Australia, it's not. It won't be a big percentage of people, heating their homes with firewood. We're probably using electricity to heat our homes. And then for cooking, I'm sure most of you are cooking on an electric or gas stove. There are many parts of the world where cooking is done on open flame fires. And so those fires need timber or charcoal to be able to function. So that's what they mean by fuel wood collection. So only 6%, but it is still a pretty big problem. That's probably something we could tackle quite easily. That's a much smaller number to be able to tackle. That might involve lifting people out of poverty and things like that, giving them access to electricity and natural gas for cooking. So let's take a look at this in a bit more detail. So like I mentioned, agriculture and logging to some sense are the main direct causes of deforestation. So when we say direct, I need to build a farm and there is a forest in the way. I'm going to chop down that forest to be able to build my farm. That's the direct cause for that deforestation of that area. Over the next couple of slides, I want you to think about the indirect drivers of deforestation. So they may not actually be the main influencing factor for that deforestation. So you can actually put these into 3 different categories: social, political, and economic. So if I'm looking at social factors that might be indirectly driving deforestation, it might be that I'm living in a country that has, developed quickly. People are becoming wealthier. We want more of these luxury products. And so a result of that might be that deforestation or logging is increasing because they needed more timber in order for us to live our more luxurious lifestyle. So the fact that I want to, buy a brand new IKEA kitchen, is going to be an indirect driver for deforestation. So it may not be that they've chopped down that tree to build my IKEA kitchen. It might actually be, the fact that they've knocked it down for agricultural purposes. They can then go and use that wood to go and build my IKEA kitchen. So there can be indirect drivers for deforestation. So like I said, for the next couple of slides, see if you can think about what are the social influences for deforestation, economic, political. So think about the countries where deforestation is occurring in. Think about when we say political, I'm talking about laws, legislation, management of forests. How could they be influencing deforestation? So as we're going through, have that in the back of your mind. I've popped it up in the top right hand corner for you. So we'll have a look at that on our next slide. So human processes that are driving deforestation. Our first one I've labeled as infrastructure. So if you're looking on the textbook, I'm on page 114, and it's the first little arrow. And so, I've pointed this out as these are improvements to infrastructure that can be causing this deforestation. So improvements might be, the creation of a mine. How is that an improvement? Well, when you think about it, if we're creating a mine, there's going to be some economic benefit to creating that mine. So we're selling resources. We would need to chop down those trees in order to create that mine. I've got down dams as well. Dams are going to be really important, allowing provision of water for consumption, but it could be damming water to irrigate crops and things like that. Transport seems to be a main one as well. So that could be the building of roads, rail lines, highways, airports, etc. And then of course, rural settlement facilities. So where do we find most of our forested areas? Well, what we call rural. So it might be the development of a hospital or a school, and we might need to chop down some of those trees or that forested area to make way for those facilities. The examples that they've got in there that have triggered deforestation, the construction of the Trans-Amazonia Highway in Brazil, in South America, and you've also got a large-scale transmigration program in Indonesia. All of these, at the time, they may not have realized that deforestation was occurring, but looking back, hindsight is a wonderful thing. We can see that it's actually large-scale deforestation in both Brazil and Indonesia because of these infrastructure programs. So for Indonesia, large-scale transmigration programs, that's where you have got people moving out of the crowded main island of Indonesia and moving out to these small islands that may not have had any people on them, or maybe small amounts of people. And of course, Indonesia being on the equator, lots of tropical rainforests, they're chopping those down to make way for people. People need to live somewhere. So it's looking at balancing that out. So from the 1960s, you'll find that there's large-scale deforestation occurring in those two countries. Of course, everyone remembers this one, agriculture. So development of agricultural practices as our human process. So one of the main things here is that we need to ensure food security. So we need to eat. People need to eat. We can't let people die of starvation. Although millions of people do die from starvation each year, as a society, we need to ensure people can be fed. So that often has a consequence of deforestation. You'll find as well in a lot of countries, agriculture will be subsidized by the governments. Farming is not easy work. Not everyone wants to do it. I certainly don't want to be a farmer. I'm not sure if any of you want to be farmers. So to promote, people moving into that industry so we can support our population with food, it'll oftentimes be heavily subsidized by the government. So when I say subsidize, it means the government actually pays a lot of money for farms to operate. And those farms can only operate on cleared land, essentially. So, You'll also find that it may be in an area, often developing countries, the production of food is actually more valuable than the forest. So we're lucky in Australia, we might value forests a lot more than, say, a developing country. People are generally well off here, so we enjoy the forests I can escape the city and I can go relax on a walk in the forest. That has a lot of value for us. So we have a lot of protections on our forests. But in a developing country where they may not have the luxury of, taking a little holiday into like the forested areas or going for a bushwalk, things like that, they might not have that luxury. And so their first priority is to make sure that people can be fed and not die. So food production can often trump forests, and so they'll happily knock down a forest so that people can actually be fed. This is probably one of our greatest issues in terms of deforestation. So looking at laws, so this, I guess, man-made thing as a human process to deforestation, but you might look at forest protection laws. So certainly in Australia, we'll have our forestry management, and so we'll have laws and regulations about how forests are used, and you can't knock down this forest because this is a managed forest, such as a national park or a state park, and things like that. Now the problem is these forests are obviously quite large, very isolated locations, and it does come with it some significant financial requirements and a workforce to enforce those regulations. So if you're in a much underdeveloped or poorer country, they may have protection of a forest, but it may not be able to be enforced sufficiently because they lack the resources or the money to actually enforce it. And because of that lack of policing or enforcement, you may actually get illegal logging, or it might be illegal trade in timber or forest products. So that can be an influencing factor on deforestation. And of course, a process leading to deforestation. So the process of deforestation here is logging, the destruction of the forest. It's logging, but the driving factor here, some activities that might be promoting it or allowing it to happen, may be the laws around the management of that forest. Now, in this sense, I think that it is not necessarily the laws that are allowing the deforestation. No, of course, these laws are trying to stop it. It's the lack of financial resources and manpower to enforce these laws that then allow for this illegal logging. So you could look at this as a driving factor that is leading to the human process of logging, or in this case, illegal logging. Our next category is looking at, I guess, land rights. So who owns that part of the forest? And this can be particularly hard to judge or hard to work out when there are perhaps indigenous minorities that are living within these forested areas, or land that is designated for indigenous people. So this can be a hard one to tackle because, of course, different countries will have different laws in terms of identifying indigenous communities. And so we might have a system where you might have land tenure that determines who can use the land and access its natural resources. So for example, in Australia, much of the outback is labelled as Crown land, which means it's owned by the government. However, the government will lease sections of that land to mining companies, for example, and they may need to clear a forest. The complicated layer on top of that is it may be within an area that is owned by the indigenous Aboriginals or Torres Strait Islanders as well. And so they will have a connection to that land. So it's an extremely tricky one to actually tackle. Who actually owns this forest, and what are the laws in that land in terms of who can actually own the forest and the resources within there? So yeah, land tenure conditions can be really unclear in many forested areas in the developing world. So you'll find across the entire world, lots of countries will have indigenous populations, and who has control over those resources and things like that. Because of this, it can lead to a manipulation of vulnerable communities. So, for many indigenous forest communities, the idea of possession and selling land or its product is a foreign concept. For hundreds, if not thousands of years, they've not done that. They've maintained the land and looked after the land. They've never actually owned the land. Say here in Australia, Indigenous Australians, they're very sustainable, look after the land. They've never actually said, "Oh, I own this." They'll use that land sustainably, move on, and they may revisit it later on. So this can be really, really difficult to work out. So like I said, a lot of those forest communities can actually be manipulated. So not such a huge problem here in Australia, but you will find that in many developing countries, this can be a real issue. Okay, so wars and civil disruption. So they can be a lot of human conflicts that will lead to deforestation. This has happened a lot throughout history. The example from the text, and the one that I've popped up here, is about Rwanda. So if you aren't sure of what Rwanda was all about, there was a genocide in this part of Africa. I can't quite remember from the top of my head when, but it led to mass migration. And so you had in this case, there were about 750,000 people that needed to flee Rwanda, in order to not be murdered through genocide. So three-quarters of a million people moved to the Virunga National Park in their next door neighbors' country, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And so they did set up camp near this national park. Can you imagine? You've nearly got 1 million people displaced, moving as refugees. And so they've gone to this large, area. It was actually a protected mountain gorilla habitat as well. So you've got another vulnerable population in there, and a huge section was actually deforested to be able to accommodate these refugees. And this is what I mean in terms of, as geographers, how do you handle this? So you've got that gorilla population, for example, that was vulnerable, that it's protected, but at the same time, you've got people that are being murdered in a civil war, and are trying to flee in order to, save their lives. And so, you can't blame them for leaving that area and having that displacement. And so it's one of the hardest things, I guess, war is a pretty awful thing, but it's quite difficult to be able to manage the impacts of humans. So deforestation occurs in this place, and it's occurred because of a war. So of course the actual process of chopping down those trees to make way, that never changes. I mean, maybe they burnt it, maybe they chopped down the trees, who knows, but the actual steps that led to that point of knocking down that forest is, say, very different to trying to provide food for a population. In this case, it's trying to find a safe place for a population so they aren't killed in a civil war. And our last one for human processes, looking at economic growth. Now, I'd be really happy for any of you to argue that this economic growth is the underlying driver of deforestation and forest degradation. I'd say it almost falls under, remember I spoke about these driving factors. economic driving factor was one of them. I think this almost falls under every single category as to what's driving deforestation: human processes. So developing countries use the land and products of their forests as a means of alleviating poverty, as in such regions, the imperative of providing food security and a basic income may take precedence over the obligation of protecting forests. So I mentioned before, the forested area may seem valuable, but providing food for their population is going to be more important than, say, looking after that forest. In the short term, you might say, look, no, we've got to feed those people. But the long-term consequences of that deforestation are becoming really, really, really clear for us as geographers. So is there another way of actually providing that food security? What can we do differently so we don't have to be chopping down these forests? Because we know the issues that come with deforestation. Providing a basic income, I thought, was a really interesting one as well. So, we live in a world where, the economy is extremely important for our livelihood. So we need to be able to make money in order to, pay our rent or buy our house and buy food and, acquire basic services. So you may have a country that is happy to log a forest because it's going to provide a basic income for that population. So yeah, I'd say you could, I'd really love to hear your thoughts on this. Where can you see economic growth in all of those human processes that are leading to deforestation? So at the beginning, I spoke about interconnection. Natural and human processes are going to have an interconnection. And of course, the different human processes that I spoke about can be interconnected as well. So it doesn't have to be just between that natural and human. So it could potentially be that you might have your natural processes, say pests and disease, that are causing deforestation in a region. Now, those pests and disease could have actually been introduced by humans, so it may not have actually occurred naturally. And that often is the case. So I don't know if any of you have ever traveled by car between states, say Victoria and New South Wales, but you'll often see signs saying, you've got to throw out your fruit, you can't bring it across the border. And that's, to try and prevent the spread of fruit fly. You'll see it when you come in to Australia as well, flying into the airports. You can't bring any foods, and that's your laws, that human influence, that's preventing humans from introducing, say, a species that could devastate a forest or whatever it may be. So I want you to be able to point out that interconnection between those processes. But like I mentioned, it could be interconnection between the different human processes as well. So, for example, you might have conflict in an area that's caused deforestation. That conflict may have actually started because a country may have seen an economic benefit to a forested area, and they want to challenge that country's sovereignty over that area. So you might have a clash between countries. You might have a clash within a country. Say you might have states or provinces or whatever the country uses, saying that they want to own that resource and gain an economic benefit from it. So by exploiting that resource, they may gain an economic benefit. So, I've just mentioned several different categories there where they may actually be working with each other. So have a go at being able to link all of these. Interconnection is a really important factor to be looking at. Of course, humans can influence natural processes as well. So what we are doing, that deforestation, the act of chopping down these trees en masse, can actually lead to a change in climate as well. So we know that climate change is one of the natural processes. We know climate change is natural, but we're exacerbating it. And that can have an impact on deforestation itself. So the act of chopping down trees by humans can continue to exacerbate the natural process of climate change, which may deforest an area. So You can see how they're interconnected in that sense. That next point I have here, the initial impetus for forest clearing may be provided by high global timber prices that motivate logging operations and the construction of access roads by government authorities. This could then be followed by agricultural expansion in the deforested areas. So, although an area may have been cleared and now used for agricultural expansion, it may not have been agriculture that was the driving factor for the clearing of that forest. It may have just been they're going to make way more money by selling that timber at that point in time. And so they cut down the trees for that purpose. But now they're able to use it as an agricultural area. That last dot point there, that has been the case in Southeast Asia. So on page 111, you see that picture comparison in figure 8.8, Southeast Asia, those forested areas in 1970 and then in 1990. You can see the primary forest areas significantly reduced. And a lot of that land is now used as agricultural land. So a lot of those trees were actually initially cut down to sell that timber to promote, and that was, fueling growth around the world with building and infrastructure, and that's where we were getting our timber from. Now those areas have become agricultural areas for those countries. Okay, so that is it in terms of the natural processes and human processes / activities. Take a look at the figures for this section. So we're on page 114 to page 116. So take a look at there's two graphs there to take a look at. Make sure you've read through those. And yeah, do whatever you need to do to summarize this information. Maybe this video is enough for you to help you with your summary. But yeah, these are the main points that I want you to remember in terms of what are the causes. So what are the human activities that cause deforestation? What are the natural processes? And I challenge you to think of some other ones as well. I mean, these are the main ones. You may be able to come up with some other ones too. I do just want you to answer two questions. I did grab these from our text. You can see there's 5 questions to answer from the text. I don't want you to answer the 5. What I do want you to answer is these 2 that I've kind of changed here. So describe and explain the causes of deforestation. So this is just really to help you summarize what we've just looked at. I then want you to identify which cause you consider to have had the greatest impact for each continent over the last 2 centuries. Why do you think this is? And I apologize for that little spelling error there. I've just been editing this video and it would take a long time to actually fix that up, so I'm being really lazy. Think about providing data for this. I've just given you a little hint for that. So think about the continent of Australia. Over the last 200 years, what have been the main causes of deforestation? Identify them, and why do you think it is that, whatever it is that's been causing deforestation in Australia, hint, hint, agricultural activity, urban development, why do you think that is? Do you have any data to help support that? So for my little hint there, you might talk about the growing population in Australia. And we've had a huge skyrocket in terms of population. So do that for each continent. If you've forgotten what continents exist, Australia, Asia, South America, North America, Europe, and Africa. So you can forget about Antarctica. So yeah, if you can do that for each of those continents, that might take you a little bit of time. Next, just for the last question, for each of the human processes, list what you think could be driving factors. So when we look through those human processes, I had that little reminder in the top right hand corner. Think about that: social, economic, political. What are the factors that might be driving that deforestation? So for agriculture, as a driving factor, or agriculture as a human process, how are there any social factors influencing it, any economic factors influencing, any political? So have a think about that, little dot points, whatever you need, just to show me that you're kind of thinking outside of these pages in the textbook, and thinking what's actually driving that decision by humans to create a farm where this forest might have been. So yeah, have a go at that. Share them with me. You can just share them into a Google Doc. I'm still trying to think of what is easiest to actually see your work. So I think maybe just if you have like your Google Drive, feel free to share that with me and I can jump in there and have a look, or just flick me an email. So if you could get those done for me, that would be great.
All right, so that is our class for today. I really hope that you got a lot out of it. Just I guess as a reminder, we were looking at page 114 to 116, not too much there. In our next lesson, we will look at the consequences of deforestation. We'll be able to then have a look at a couple of the case studies. So please feel free to read ahead. You really should be reading ahead and doing your own bit of research. I know that when I'm going through notes for law school, I will always read through whatever case I'm looking at or the lecture slides, and I'll start asking questions as my notes, and then I'll go and research those questions. So I find I understand the content a lot more when I'm asking questions about the content and then looking for those answers. I think that can be a really good way of actually doing summary rather than rewriting. I mean, it's already written there, so why do you need to rewrite it? So, I hope you got a lot out of this video. Please, like I said at the beginning, give me some feedback. If you prefer the pre-recorded, it obviously means things are going to be so much more flexible for you. Again, I will always be available during those 3 periods a week that we have. So send me an email or jump onto Gmail and use the chat function. It'll get sent straight to my phone if you use the chat function. So I will send out another video to you for our next lesson. So have a great day, everyone. I should also say thank you so much for submitting your geography report, our virtual fieldwork. I'll be looking forward to going through and reading those. Thanks so much for your hard work, geographers. We're doing our best and trying to save the world at the same time. So I'll see you next time.